On this edition of Geopolitics and Empire, we interview Professor Paul Robinson from the University of Ottawa, whose research includes Russian history and security and defense policy. He's written numerous books, the most recent of which is a biography on the Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich. He has a great blog where he posts very good articles at irrationality.wordpress.com. That's with 2 R's and 2 S's, irrationality. We will be discussing Putin, Trump, and the current state of U.S.-Russia relations. And it's a great pleasure to have you on, Professor Robinson.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, why don't we start with, the most fun topic, the most controversial topic, the topic of President Putin. You recently wrote a book review on Russia without Putin, which tells us that every conversation about Russia need not revolve around Putin. However, I would like to discuss first both Putin, the individual, and then the Russian state structure that lives on with or without Putin. So I guess the first question would be, Putin has been depicted in the West as the personification of evil. Hillary Clinton has called him Hitler, which is an immense diplomatic faux pas, in my opinion. There have been dozens, if not hundreds, of newspaper and magazine covers depicting Putin as Dr. Evil, as an octopus, as a bloody dictator. However, I think when you travel to Russia and speak to people from all walks of life, as I have, you will find that this is not quite the case, that even people who dislike Putin himself prefer having him in power for now because they prefer stability. So for you as an academic and an analyst, what are the most important points when discussing Putin?
I think the first thing to be aware of is that when one's thinking of Russian foreign policy and also, of course, Russian domestic policy, it's not all the product of one man, and that it's a product of many social and political forces. And to a certain degree, Putin himself is a product of this system as much as a creator of this system. And that were you to change the person in charge, it's unlikely that particularly foreign policy, but also many domestic policies would change very significantly. Putin is sometimes described in very harsh language as sort of extremist, nationalist, and so on and so forth. But actually, my own reading of this, and I'm not alone in this, is that as Russian politics goes, he's fairly much of a centrist, fairly much well aligned with the mass of public opinion. Indeed, his success, I think, is very much due to his ability to read where the mass of public opinion is going and to align himself more or less with it. Therefore, if you were to have a different leader, he would probably be, or she would be forced in a very similar direction, because that is what Russian society as a whole is generally looking for.
And what about the Putin that is depicted as someone who assassinates every dissenter, critic, journalist, rogue politician, and so on?
Well, I on the one hand, I don't think one should be, overly idealize the Russian state and consider that it's, incapable of unpleasant actions, because I think that's not true. And there are a number of cases, for instance, the Litvinenko case and the Skripal poisoning, in which there is certainly some good reason to suspect the involvement of the Russian state in those particular killings and attempted killings. But that does not mean that every Russian who drops dead prematurely has been murdered personally at the orders of Putin, because we don't actually have any very good evidence of that. And if you look at many of the claims which are made about people having been killed at Putin's direct orders, there really isn't very much evidence, or the evidence doesn't stack up. We saw this, for instance, recently in the case of Mr. Perepelichny, who was associate former of, I think, of Berezovsky. I can't remember the exact details. And he died while out jogging in the United Kingdom. And there was a lot of suspicion that, Putin had ordered his murder. But an inquest in the United Kingdom just a couple of weeks ago declared that there was absolutely no evidence of foul play. So, I think you need to be very careful about a lot of these claims, because, while there is some evidence of Russian state involvement in one or two cases, there isn't in the overwhelming majority of them. And when one looks at things also such as murders of journalists, then actually fewer journalists have been killed under Putin in Russia than under Yeltsin. And those who have been killed, it tends to be related to organized crime and mafia and investigations into those kind of things.
And you talked a bit about how the Russian state and the people kind of look for a certain direction, based on the latest blog post you wrote. Is there anything you'd like to add about the Russian state and how it functions with or without Putin?
Well, I think that the Russian state, like all states, makes policy due to a large variety of complex inputs and through a large variety of complex processes. I think that it's a very imperfect system, and that many of the complaints which are made about it in that regard are not entirely unfounded, and that the Russian state, it certainly seems to me, the central state has rather limited control over its own subordinates, particularly in the peripheries. This has been a perpetual problem in Russian governance, that the state in Moscow or St. Petersburg in previous times can issue all sorts of edicts, but there's no particular guarantee it has that things are going to be done the way it wants to be done. Many problems in Russia are due to local abuses, which the state either is unable to stop or turns a blind eye to because of convenience and so on. But the problem is very often is, in my mind, it comes from a weak state rather than an overly powerful state.
And what would you make of the recent news about the Russia altering the constitution to allow Putin to remain beyond 2024?
Well, I think that would be unwise. I do think that I'm personally of the view that it would have been better for Putin and not to have stood for election in 2012, because I think a regular turnover of politicians is a good idea. And the personal dominance of Putin has I think has a negative effect on political competition in Russia, because he's so dominant that anyone with political ambitions is necessarily going to ally himself or herself with the party of power, because it's certainly going to win, and therefore that has an effect of stifling competition within the system, which I don't think is a good thing. So I don't think it would be wise for Putin to stay on in any way after 2024. And if constitutions are things you can just change for personal convenience, then that's not a very encouraging sign. So I would be thoroughly against that kind of thing.
And you've recently written about Russiagate, this idea of Russia meddling in U.S. elections and Trump being a Russian agent. And I believe you titled your blog post Trump as the worst secret agent ever. And I mean, from my perspective, if you look at things, I'm a U.S. citizen as well. And if you look at things kind of objectively, it seems the allegations don't seem, well, so far haven't produced very much evidence. And so what's your comment on the whole fiasco that's going on right now in the U.S. regarding this scandal?
Well, I think there's two things need to be differentiated here. The first is so-called Russian interference, and the second is collusion, because they're different things, although to some degree related. Politically speaking, the latter, collusion, is a far more serious allegation against Trump than interference. If the Russians were interfering in American electoral processes, but Trump had nothing to do with it, then that's not a reason to be attacking Trump. The only reason to attack Trump is this idea that he was somehow in cahoots with the Russians, that he struck some sort of deal with them whereby the Russians would help him in return for which he promised them something or other. We don't know exactly what. Now, in terms of evidence of interference, some has been produced in terms of internet trolls, Facebook ads, and so on and so forth. Personally, I don't think it adds up to very much. If really American democracy is so fragile that a handful of advertisements on Facebook can change regime, then something is seriously wrong, and perhaps you ought to be looking at that rather than the issue of external interference. And I think to a certain degree, the talk about interference is a deflection, which allows people to avoid considering internal problems, which they don't really want to deal with. As for collusion, I've seen no evidence of it at all. It's a thoroughly unsubstantiated allegation. It's clearly being made for political purposes, but it has a whole bunch of people who truly believe in it, despite the lack of evidence. But I think they're going to have major problems making anything along those grounds, along those lines, sticking, simply because, proof that Trump is an agent of the Russian state, or has been taking instructions from the Russian state, or has struck some deal with the Russian state in order to be elected. The evidence is just not there.
Along those lines, I'd like to get your take on the media landscape and the information war. We have one narrative produced in Western media. We have another narrative in, Russian media, such as RT and Sputnik and others. And then you have online alternative media. There have been recently reports out of Britain, this Integrity Initiative. We've seen Silicon Valley kind of, meddle with things, Google and Facebook and algorithms. There's one of America's top psychologists, Brian Epstein, has written about this. And so what are your tips, advice, and how should we decipher information, disinformation, and try to come to the most accurate assessments of the state of affairs?
I think what you need to do, what people need to do is take information from as broad a variety of sources as they possibly can, and to consider where information is coming from, not take things at face value, and to clearly differentiate what they're receiving in terms of what is fact and what is commentary and analysis. I think that the current atmosphere in both Russia, media atmosphere in both Russia and the West, is very bad. There are strongly held positions which dominate in the medias of both sides, which don't allow for very much introspection or consideration of one's own side's faults, and are leading increasingly to calls for censorship, suppression of so-called fake news, of outlets which you disapprove of because they give opinions which you don't like and which you consider to be foreign propaganda, and so on. And this is, I think, entirely the wrong way to go. Rather than trying to suppress other points of view, what one should be doing is seeking them out, and even when they turn out to be rubbish, well, at least you get a sense of what the other guy is saying. Rather than trying to narrow what we're reading and what we're watching, we should be thinking in terms of widening it.
Let's talk a little bit about the more dangerous aspects of U.S.-Russia relations. Some people say we are in a new Cold War. I believe Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that we are not in a new Cold War. Some people call it the Colder War, Cold War 2.0. We have NATO expansion. Now they're discussing adding Bosnia, Montenegro, and Macedonia, as well as eventually Ukraine, I suppose. We have a new arms race. Russia developing these hypersonic missiles such as Avangard. What is your analysis from the security and defense aspect regarding U.S.-Russia relations, and how dangerous is the situation? I know other academics such as Stephen Cohen has said that it's worse than the original Cold War.
Well, I don't think it's a Cold War in the sense of a global struggle for power like we had in the Cold War. I mean, the Cold War was very bad in many ways. People were seriously worried about a nuclear war, which I don't think most people are nowadays. And there were a large number of proxy wars which took place across the world, in Latin America, in Africa particularly, in which the two blocks would support one side or another. And if you look at statistics on international violence, it went up and up and up and up throughout the Cold War period up to about 1992, after which it declined. So the situation is not like that. And I think Stephen Cohen is being a little bit too alarmist. Where it is bad is in what we've just been discussing to some degree in the media landscape and the language, and a certain, I'd say, increasingly paranoid and McCarthy-esque sort of atmosphere in which screams of disinformation and fake news and everything else are making it very difficult for reasoned debate to take place, and a lot of massive exaggeration about the scale of the threat from Russia is taking place. And that is disturbing. And in some respects, that is somewhat worse actually than I remember it being when I was young, back in the 1980s. Although I don't think it's yet reached the peak of the McCarthy committee and all that. So things are not good, and in many ways they're quite depressing. But I don't think we're quite at where we were back in the Cold War.
And what would you make of the recent incident in the Black Sea and the Kerch Strait with the naval ships with Ukraine and Russia?
Well, I think it's difficult to make a judgment on those things in the absence of all the evidence, because what we have is different claims from both parties, and for someone like me sitting in Canada to assess which claims are accurate is very difficult. I mean, what we know is that under international law, the Ukrainians have a right of what's called peaceful transit, innocent passage through territorial waters of other states. So that would allow Ukrainian ships to transit through Russian territorial waters. However, the UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, also says that this right of innocent passage is dependent on obedience of local laws required for safety of traffic, which allows, which in this particular circumstance means that Ukrainian ships transiting through Russian territorial waters in the area of the Kerch Straits have to obey the safety rules applied by the Russian Federation, which means stopping and asking for a Russian pilot to take them through a very narrow channel. But now this is when we get into issues of fact. Did the Ukrainians ask for that or did they not? Right? And Ukraine said, yes, we did everything right. And the Russians say no. And then one also gets into issues of, proportional response. So if the Ukrainians were acting contrary to the rules because they did not ask for a pilot and stop and so on, was then the Russian response proportional? And that gets very subjective. So I think these issues are actually extremely complicated. And if I have anything to say on this whole issue of Ukraine and Western relations, is we need to, everybody should be aware that this isn't black and white. There are very complex things here, and we need to study shades of gray and nuances and actually pin down facts rather than just throwing accusations left, right, and center, in which one side is right and one side is wrong, and it's purely black and white.
So I've been asking a lot of questions, and I'm wondering. For you, having written numerous books on this, I think you're writing. You have a forthcoming book, which you can tell us about in a little bit. But what do you find? What else have I missed? What do you find important in this discussion, or of interest, especially to you?
Well, I think I would just sort of continue on from what I am just saying, and I think that there is a lot of hysteria at the moment about Russia. There's also in Russia, a lot of hysteria about the West. There's a lot of people blaming each other. There's a total lack of introspection, really, on both sides, with people being willing to admit, their own responsibility for what is going on, and the fact that they have a share of the blame for it. And I think that if we're going to sort these things out, instead of blaming each other, we need to sort ourselves out first. I mean, that's sort of political statement from me. And in analytical terms, I'd say that I think we're in what international relations specialists would call a classic security dilemma. This is the kind of thing which undergraduates learn about in almost their first week of international relations classes, in which one state takes measures to defend itself against what it sees as a possible threat from another state, but then by taking measures to defend itself, it is seen as threatening by the other state, which then, of course, takes measures to defend itself, which are then seen as threatening by the other state. And you end up in a cycle of increasing suspicion and increasing tension. So we got to be very aware here that things we do which we think we're doing for our own security and safety and are totally defensive are not likely to be seen that way by other parties, and are therefore likely to cause responses from them which are going to make things worse. And I think instead of continually saying we need to do more about our defense and we need to do more about our security and we need to, send more troops to Latvia or clamp down on disinformation and the Russians' equivalent of it, both sides should be thinking more in terms of, okay, look, we've got a problem between us. How do we resolve it? Let's try and dial things down. Let's not be continually, increasing arms expenditure, doing this, doing that, raising tensions, but thinking about how to dial things back. And I don't see a lot of that kind of thinking going on. In fact, we have a kind of problem right now where if you engage in that kind of thinking, then you're accused of being, apologists for the other side. You're forced to shut up. And that's very, very unhealthy.
Since you were discussing this, where countries react to certain events and it kind of leads to chain of events, chain reaction, I guess one of my final questions would be the Russian response as well to economically. They've tried to become more self-sustainable, in the agricultural area. They're looking now towards China with the Belt and Road and the Eurasian project. And I think they just recently purchased 25% of the yuan reserves in the whole world, and they're looking to de-dollarize. And so I guess my final question would be, what are your thoughts on this shift? It seems like Russia earlier had tried to work with the West, with Europe, and to incorporate, but they were just met with this kind of wall. And so now they're looking east.
Yeah, I think that from an economic point of view, these kind of measures are suboptimal. They're not what Russia would be doing in, ideal free market conditions, right? And ideal political conditions. And therefore, there is inevitably going to be a negative effect on the Russian economy because of this. So, for instance, we see at the moment how the Russian central bank is keeping interest rates pretty high, even though inflation is very low, and it's doing this essentially in order to hedge its bets and to provide a degree of safety in case there's increased sanctions. Okay, because increased sanctions are likely to push inflationary pressures up. So the Russian government is like hoarding money, keeping interest rates high, and so on, in order to be in a safe condition if really serious sanctions are then added. But of course, while that it provides you a safety net for the future, in the short term, this is suppressing economic activity and stopping economic growth. So I think these kind of measures to separate Russia to certainly a small degree, not massively, but to a small degree from the West are economically suboptimal. On the other hand, the Russian government clearly feels that from a political strategic point of view, it has no choice. So I think therefore such measures will continue. They will have a not a massively but a mildly suppressive effect on economic growth in Russia. But politically speaking, what they will do is they will gradually reduce the West's leverage on Russia. So by sanctioning Russia and pressuring Russia, actually the West is putting itself in a position where it's losing its ability to pressure Russia in the future. It's shoving Russia further away from itself, which is actually not going to help us. So these sanctions, they don't help Russia, but we're not helping us in the West either.
I just had a final thought or question. I was just a bit curious. You're in Canada, and I was just wondering, have you had any trouble? Because you do seem kind of to question things a little bit more than the usual academics, and you have a fair approach. I mean, your blog is called Irrationality. And have you ever had any trouble at the university or in academia with anybody?
Not in the university. University is fine. There is you do get accused by people of being in the pay of the Kremlin or so on. There's a report which has just been issued by a think tank here, which I don't really want to go into it for some legal reasons, but it could be considered defamatory against a whole bunch of people here for taking positions which are considered to be not sufficiently hostile to the Russian Federation. So I'd say within academia, it was not a problem at all. And I get my stuff published in academic peer-reviewed journals and so on. I find academics are generally fairly open and sensible and balanced. I would say that the think tank world, politicians, the media is a somewhat different issue.
And so, could you tell us about your forthcoming book? If I'm not mistaken, you've mentioned it in some of your posts, and I think it deals with Russian conservatism.
Yeah, so this book is going to be a history of Russian conservatism from around 1800 up to the present day. So it will look at how Russian conservatism could be defined, what its origins are, what conservatives, be they what one might call state conservatives, official conservatives, or conservative philosophers, have thought and said over 200 years, and try to track sort of what common themes one can draw out of this and what significance this has for modern Russia as well.
All right. I'll be looking forward to that book. And how can people best follow you? I guess is irrationality.wordpress.com?
That is the place to go. So IRRUSSIANALITY, irrationality. Look that up and follow the blog, and that's the way to go.
Okay, and also to remind people, they can also subscribe to the American Committee for East-West Accord, where it's a daily email list all about U.S.-Russia, and they include stories from all perspectives. And I think they include most of your postings there as well. And again, we thank you, Dr. Robinson, for your time and the work that you do.
Okay, well, thank you.